The trans debate. Why are we making it so difficult? So we'll be starting off with a bit of scientific background, which may be a bit tedious, sorry. Then I'll do a little bit of sociology, and then a fairly contemptuous analysis of the current approaches, and then I'm going to make some suggestions. So here we go. Unfortunately, I will have to discuss some of the background science to make any sense of this. I'll try and make it as quick and painless as possible. So first I'm going to describe distributions. Now just imagine we wanted to draw out the way people's weights distributed themselves through the population. So I draw a graph like this, with the percentage on the left-hand side showing the percentage of the population that have a certain weight, and a scale of weights going along the bottom, from left to right increasing. Well, most people, the largest number of people have a weight around 70 kilograms. If you look at the people who have weight around 60 or 80 kilograms, there's a bit less on either side of that. Then as you go further out and you're looking at people with a weight of 50 or 90 kilograms, there's a lot less people in those groups. And as you go further out, it kind of tails away like that. And if we draw a line over that graph, it looks kind of like this. And then if we just kind of, instead of using big wide 10 kilogram chunks, we can narrow the chunks down, the graph becomes smoother. And eventually you get a graph kind of like this. Now this is a graph I stole off the internet because I'm not very good at drawing things. But it's worth noting that this has been divided into little sections here. We see these numbers along the bottom, 1, 2, 3 and minus 1, 2, 3. Well, these are what we call the standard deviations, which are a bit of a statistician type thing. But it's worth noting that the two central standard deviations have got most of the people in them. That's between the kind of 60 to 80 kilogram branches. That's where most of the population lies. 2/3 of people seem to have a weight in those groups. And then you get about a sixth of people have a weight below that, and a sixth of people have a weight above that. And you end up with this kind of layout here. Now, as this is a presentation about gender, I'm going to want to look at the male and female genders differently. So let's take kind of an example here of heights, where you have a graph of the average height. The average person in the UK has a height of about 5'7", I think, something on average like that. And this will be it graphed here. However, if you look at obviously, the females tend to be on the smaller side of that distribution, the males tend to be on the taller side. Now, suppose I separate out those two graphs. I do a specific graph for the female and a specific graph for the male. It looks more like this. So now you have two separate averages. You've got the average for the female and the average for the male. The average for the female being about 5'4", and the average for the male, I think, being about 5'8", something like that. The exact numbers don't really matter. What is worth noticing, though, is that if you look at the difference between the averages for males and females, it's about, as I said, 4 inches. But the difference between a quite small woman and a quite tall woman is more like 12 inches. In fact, the difference in average between male and female, for instance, in this case of height, is a lot less than the range of heights for the males or the females. Now, we can do these distributions for all sorts of characteristics. Weight, height, like we just looked at, but those would be eyesight, shoe size, nose length, pretty much anything. But what I'm interested in is personality traits. For the purpose of this presentation, that's what we're going to discuss. So we're going to go on and discuss the gendering of personality traits through genes. Now, it's obvious to anyone that men and women have different behavioral patterns. Now, some people would argue whether that's due to nature or nurture, but they definitely exist. Now, it's pretty obvious to everybody that males and females seem to have different personalities, broadly speaking. To men tend to be more aggressive and competitive, and women tend to be more altruistic and sociable. Men are more risk-taking, or bloody stupid as it's otherwise known. Women tend to suffer from anxiety more. Men are more physical, women are more nurturing, etc., etc. There's lots of debates about whether this is due to nature or nurture, but as I said, I'm interested in the bit that's about nature. If you want to know more about this, it's very helpful to look at this paper, which summarizes maybe the top 10 best replicated scientific findings in this field. When I say replicated, I mean that they've been repeated by multiple scientists independently who got the same results. If you want to take this down, pause this video, and you can find it at this position here. Now, one of the points that came out of this article here is that about 30 to 50% of your characteristics are inherited from your parents. That's what they can work out so far. Okay, so at least 30 to 50% of your personality is genetic. So here we're only interested in those aspects of personality that are moderated by genetics, the kind of things that appear in young children, as children appear with their own personalities, or so I'm told. I'm not discussing the effects of upbringing. I don't deny they exist, but that's not what I'm talking about here. Quick word about the psychology definitions that psychologists use to define these personality traits. There are kind of 5 top-level groups: agreeableness, neuroticism, conscientiousness, extroversion, and openness. These are kind of 5 main groups psychologists talk about. Now, in fact, each of these groups breaks down into a number of subgroups, each of which behave somewhat differently for males and females. So, for instance, women tend to be higher in neuroticism because they're higher in anxiety than generally men are. On the other hand, some men are neurotic, but they tend to be neurotic by being angry. Likewise, for instance, openness. Women tend to be a bit more open than men, but they tend to be more open to feelings, whereas men tend to be more open to ideas. So we're just going to kind of look at these high-level definitions as representative. In reality, it's a lot more complicated when you get further down below. But these will be good enough just to be able to get the idea across that I'm trying to describe. Now, we all know that genes build us. They're the blueprints that make us us. And they also give us a large part of our personality. And they do this by affecting our physical structure, everything from the thickness of our brain neurons to the effects of our endocrine systems, all sorts of things way beyond my scope of knowledge. But they define us. Now, how genes work, I'm sure we all know. Every woman has got 23 pairs of chromosomes, one from her mother, one from her father. And so these chromosomes tend to do similar jobs, so they tend to sort of balance each other out. If one of them has a mutation that gives a very strong effect, the other one will tend to kind of cancel that out a bit. So these pairs of chromosomes keep us pretty normal. Now, obviously, your parents also have 2 pairs of chromosomes, so you only get one of these chromosomes from each of your parents, and you don't know which one you got. But this is why you and your brothers and sisters aren't all exactly the same, because you actually got different chromosomes from the parents. Now, on each chromosome, you've got maybe 500 to 1,000 genes on there, and each of these genes encodes proteins, which changes you physically or defines you physically. This isn't a perfect system, so not every gene works the way it's supposed to. Some genes just don't kick off, and some genes maybe that didn't kick off in your parents do kick off in you. So again, while you're very similar to your parents, you've got lots of characteristics that people say that's from your mum, that's from your dad. There are also differences. You can be quite different from your parents in some ways because of the random activation nature of genes. Now, this is what creates these kind of distributions of personalities. First of all, you've got your random selection, or semi-random selection of the chromosomes of your parents, and then the kind of random behaviors of the actual genes themselves. And this is called epigenetics. It's the effect of the environment on the genes. So some gene in you may or may not have kicked off because your mother was lying in a hot bath at a certain time, or had drunk some alcohol, or had particularly negative acid urine or something. I don't know. It's way complicated. Okay, really complicated. And it gets even worse for males, because for the males, well, on our last pair, we don't have 2 X chromosomes. We've got one X and one Y chromosome. The Y chromosome, obviously, the one that changes us to male and when we're in the womb. It also means that the X chromosome doesn't have any balancing other X chromosomes, so we can get somewhat more variation in males than we get in females. But what you need to really know about this, it is brain-meltingly complicated and not well understood. What we do know is that all this variation and varieties and all these effects gives us a general distribution of our personality traits. Now we've got so much complexity, why don't we just go and have fun and add some more? Let's look at the X and Y chromosome. Obviously, males have the Y chromosome, and after 6 weeks, a gene called the SRY gene kicks off. And the effect of this gene is to kick off other genes on the Y chromosome. And not only that, it kicks them off on the X chromosome as well, genes that wouldn't normally activate in a female. And these cascades go around the chromosomes, turning on genes. And these are the genes that are going to make you, or make a male into a male. It's going to change your endocrine system, change your musculature, change your physique, change your psychology, change parts of your brain, change all sorts of bits of you. The trouble is that some of these cascades fail. They can fail. They can fail at the beginning or they can fail part way through. Even the SRY gene itself can fail and you just never change into male. That individual would stay female. But so all sorts of ways exist for this maling process to fail, and all sorts of different ways that can be expressed in your personality. So not only do we get these variable personality characteristics in females, but on top of that, we've got this process that changes the female characteristics into male characteristics, and it does that in an unreliable way as well. In other words, there's just so much variation in the system. I'd like to briefly apologize to any developmental biologists out there who are watching this. I'm sure a lot of what I said is wildly inaccurate or lacking nuance or simplified, but it's the best I can do. It's not my speciality. Just so you don't have to take my inexpert word for this, I put on here the summary of a research paper into this subject. And if you care to pause the video and read this, especially the bit in blue, you'll see that it's not just me saying that this is a really complicated business. Okay, so we have these genetically driven personality traits that have obviously a wide variation in them. The same way we have wide variations in height and weight and things like that. Now, what I'd like to think about now is how do the male and female distributions for these personality traits overlap, or how similar are they, how different are they? We looked at the traits for height and weight and things, and we saw that there's a definite overlap there. How is it with personalities? Now, this is difficult. It's difficult to measure these things. We kind of have to invent your own ways of measuring different risk-taking parameters or whatever for people. So I'm just going to use a kind of little rule of thumb heuristic method for myself. It doesn't have to be really accurate. It's not scientific. But I'm just basing it on my own experience. I've had a number of kind of hobbies in the past with which have different personality traits associated with them. So I've created this graph here, which I'm just using as a generic representation of personality traits. Then have a look at some of the traits that I've been involved in. I've had hobbies like scuba diving, caving, and parachuting, which obviously associate with the risk-taking kind of behavior. I've done a lot of martial arts, which is a kind of very physical behavior. I'm also a techie. I work in programming and engineering. Very techie sort of behavior. Now, these are all generally seen as quite male behaviors. But what I've always noticed is in these kinds of fields or activities that the female participation seems to be between about 10 and 20%, something like that. 15% maybe, approximately 1 in 6 participants. This is very loose here, but 1 in 6 of these participants seems to be female, and that's been a kind of consistent experience through my life. So if I take this graph as representing these general male-y characteristics, and I say, well, which of these males are the ones that are practicing these things? Now, I would say most guys don't, for instance, do martial arts, but a lot do pretty physical sports and things like that. Obviously, most people aren't engineers, but, a significant minority are working tech, particularly amongst men. And then scuba diving, this kind of risk-taking stuff. Yeah, a lot of guys do that, but not all of them by any means. So I'm just going to start with a little kind of assumption here that it's the guys on the right-hand side of this graph that tend to be doing this, all these things. They're the part of the male species that does these kind of maley things. And so that means that this area here under the graph represents the part of the graphs of personalities where these guys would be found who are doing these things. Okay, so if we say, okay, so 5 in 10 of males are doing these things, that's probably a bit much, but we'll go with it just now. Where then, if 5 in 10 are doing, where would the female graph be that would put the female characteristics in such a proportion that you'd end up with 1 in 6 females doing these things? So put the female graph here, and slide it across, it will be about here. So the area under the female graph to the right of this line is about 1/6 of the area of the male graph, roughly speaking. No, actually, it's 1/5. It's additional. So anyway, so this area here is the part of the females who would have these kind of characteristics that would have them doing the same sorts of things that the males would be doing. Now, this idea they come from this half of the graph might be a little bit too much, but even if I kind of shrink this over and say, well, it's over this 40% they come from, and because the slopes of the curves are actually quite similar, then the proportions actually remain the same. So, in fact, it probably is. It's a reasonable rule of thumb estimate that the overlaps are something like this. And it's also interesting to note, actually, if you look at the graphs, the overlaps of these personalities are not that dissimilar from the overlaps for things like height and weight and stuff. So this seems to be the level of overlap we get between male and female in characteristics. If you notice here, the separation between the males and the females is much less than the actual spread of the distribution for male or female. Just bear in mind that we actually have a great number of characteristics, and they don't all behave the same way. Some have broader spreads, others narrower spreads, with different levels of overlap between males and females for each characteristic. So I'm talking in pretty general terms here. Because we have so many characteristics, it's pretty clear that when we assess somebody's masculinity or femininity, their personality, we don't just look at one personality trait. We look at many. It's a kind of amalgamation of all their personality traits. Remember, we discussed this, that you have these kind of broad classifications: agreeableness, neuroticism, conscientiousness, extroversion, and openness. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take one notional characteristic from each of these groups. Say from agreeableness, I might take risk-taking. From neuroticism, I might take anxiety, etc., etc. Doesn't really matter which one, but I'm just going to take sort of 5 representative characteristics and see how they interact with each other. Now I'm going to try and explain what this means, what effect this has. So let's go back to our distribution here. Here I've got a male distribution. The more female values on the left, the more male values on the right. And we're going to illustrate some individuals on it. Now, obviously, individuals have many characteristics. I'm just going to use 5, and I'm going to draw them on the same distribution just so we can compare the combinations, so to speak. Now, the blue line itself, because it represents the chances of the proportion of people in the population who have a particular value for a characteristic, then for a randomly selected individual, it's the probability of them having that value for the characteristic. What this tells us is then that the majority of people will have their characteristic falling near the center. So for any characteristic, I take a random person, their characteristic probably lies, 2/3 of the time will lie close to the 0 line, between the -1 and the +1. 1/6 of the time it'll be less than the -1, and 1/6 of the time it'll be greater than the -1. So if we illustrate some people here, let's take somebody. Typically, they will have 3 or 4 of their characteristics. This is out of 5. Naturally, people have many more than 5, but we're just using 5. So out of the 5 would fall in the center 2 panels, and then 1 or 2 would fall outside that. And the 2 outliers might actually be on the same side. There's no rule. There can be any combination of values or positions here. It's random, but it's usually near the center. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to play a kind of little game. I'm adding these extra lines in here, these green dotted lines that are in the midpoint of each of these panels, the 0 to 1, 1 to 2, etc. And I'm going to make a little rule that if your characteristic is in that panel, then it lies on that line. This is just so we can do a little bit of arithmetic here to illustrate this, okay? So let's take somebody like a random guy, and he looks like this. These are where his characteristics lie. Okay, he's got 2 on either side of the center and 1 outlier on the male side. Okay, what I'm going to do is take the average of these. If I actually average these out, I get a value of 0.3, this purple dotted line here. So if I want to try another one, let's try another combination where I move one of the values further out. What I find actually is that this line now moves to 0.15. It actually moves inwards. I'm not really getting very far away from the center. Let's try and get a little bit further away from the center. Let's move both of these outliers to one side and one of these inliers, you might call them, over to the left side as well, to the female side. Let's see how far away we get from the center line. Well, you get minus 0.7. That's as far as you get. That's us trying. We could maybe move the blue marker on the positive side, the male side panel, into the female side panel near the center, and that would increase it slightly, but it wouldn't change it much. In fact, it's actually quite difficult when you start taking the average of your characteristics to get far away from the center. This combination we see here, according to my little set of rules, would only happen for 1 person in 16. Only 1 person in 16 can get even close to the -1, moving away from the center. And what this tells us is that, in fact, the distribution of the averages is much narrower than the distribution of the individual characteristics. So men and women's characteristics can overlap broadly, but when you take the average of their characteristics, you agglomerate them or accumulate them as an individual, then the actual distribution becomes much narrower because most characteristics fall near the center. To be clear, I'm not saying that people do sums with each other's personalities. What I'm really trying to say is, in reality, almost all people are mostly typical almost all the time. Now, I'm not saying that people are all just kind of similar and that we all fall into a central kind of average. Just to illustrate this, let's go back to our graph here and invent a couple of guys and compare them. So first guy, okay, he's got 3 characteristics in the central panels obeying the rules, and he's got 2 on the male side, on the male outlier side. Okay, now let's change him into another guy. Let's take these 2 characteristics out of the central panel and make them the female side outliers. Move the red characteristic into the other central panel and move the 2 outliers into the female leaning central panel. And now this guy, in fact, the 2 guys only have the red characteristic, or 20% of their characteristics in common in the central region. And they have their outliers on completely opposite sides. In fact, that they're completely different individuals, but they're both going to average out inside the usual distribution of average characteristics. So while they're both what you might call typical guys, they are actually very different individuals. How then do we compare these aggregate personalities between men and women? Well, remember when I estimated the overlap between male and female? We got this area here where I reckoned that about 10% of females fell into, or 10% of females' characteristics fell into the male half of the male distribution of that characteristic. Well, okay, so we use that to position our distributions, the overlaps, and it goes both ways. Obviously, the male characteristic distribution overlaps into the more female half of the distribution 10% of the time. If we use that to set up the positions of our two distributions here, and then we add in these curves inside, the aggregate curves or overall personality curves, we get something more like this. And you see these are actually very different from the overlaps of the individual personality traits. Here we have some overlap, but it's much less. It's very much reduced. So consider the situation here. We'll put the male distribution back on and we'll put a guy on it. Suppose there's a guy like this. He's got pretty normal distribution of several characteristics. But just by sheer random chance of the way his genes switched on and off, or what genes he inherited or whatever, he's got a couple of characteristics that are right out over here. They're right out into that 10% that's crossing into the female distribution. He's got two of them, or 40% of his characteristics. If we aggregated this guy, how would it look? Well, his aggregate value would be somewhere out here, right at the very end of the distribution of male overall personalities, but really quite comfortably within the female distribution of overall personalities. I believe this is the basic mechanism behind transgenderism, or gender dysphoria, as I think it's more commonly known. Now, I'm not saying this is a simple thing, that this just happens this one way. There are an infinite number of ways this could turn out. Just as there are so many complicated ways to be a normal guy, there are lots and lots of different ways to be transgender. So let's just invent an example here. Imagine you've got some young guy and he's got three characteristics on the male distribution here. He's got two in the central panel and one further out on the right, one male one, which maybe is a risk-taking tendency he's got. He drives too fast. He's an idiot in a car. Well, you might also have two more characteristics, which, like he likes kittens and spangly shoes. He's got some very female characteristics as well. And overall, it's enough really to drag him over to the female side of or into the female aggregate distribution. But however, what his father's seeing is a bloody idiot boy. He's really conscious of his risk-taking behavior and he's driving too fast and he shouldn't really give him the car keys, which the guy would grow up. Bloody fool that he is. Meanwhile, in the young guy's head, what he's aware of are these characteristics over on the female side of things, because he knows he's odd. So he's much more aware of that, and his father is much more aware of his outlier male characteristic. So, when the guy announces he wants to be a woman, the dad just falls off the floor with surprise. Okay, any kind of weird combination that can happen, because it's not entirely random. Some characteristics do associate with others, but effectively any kind of outcome is possible because of the random nature of the behavior of our genes during development. And this shift doesn't happen only male to female and female to male. Obviously, people can actually statistically fall very much on the outside, outlier side of their own gender. So, for instance, you could have a guy whose distribution looked like this, and he would be very much on the male side of behavior, as his accumulated behaviors would be all really male. He'd look really male to everybody. On the other hand, same happens for females. You can have a female who's very, very feminine, Disney princess type, as opposed to the Conan the Barbarian type on the other side. We don't require these people, however, to kind of dress these parts. We just accept them as they are. Now, let's just be clear. I am not an expert in any of these fields. I am trained as a scientist, but none of these fields are my field. I'm just telling you what I've picked up from the internet, what I've done in my own research. It's not hard to do. Anybody could do it. Unfortunately, a lot of the journalists and sociologists and commentators, they don't bother to do it. They just make it up as they go along. So if you want to know more about this stuff, go and look up this guy, Jordan Peterson or Robert Sapolsky. These and many, many other people out there, they're real experts in their fields. You can find out a lot out of them if you really want to know what's going on. Okay, even if you are talking to medics, make sure you're looking at medical scientists, GPs, doctors. They might get a little brief couple of lectures on these subjects when they're at university. They're not experts either. It's a really complicated subject, and you need to talk or listen to really qualified people. Now we've done a superficial overview of the roots of this phenomenon. Let's have a look at how society itself has tried to deal with it so far, and the kind of weird solutions that we seem to have come up with. To do this, let's think about how we interact with each other's personalities. So, give an example. Suppose we've got here a slightly squint room, and I enter said squint room and I find a slightly squint woman in that squint room. And I think maybe I should sort of break the ice and say something rather than stand around like a lemon. So what do I do? Well, what I don't do is I don't start discussing football scores or telling jokes about two nuns and a candle. Because from experience, that's not the kind of icebreakers that women seem to like. Now, I don't know this woman, so I just play safe. I go for something a bit vanilla, talk about the wallpaper or something, whatever, to break the ice. I avoid what you might call things women don't like. And when I'm doing this, what I'm doing is I'm using a heuristic. It's a kind of rule of thumb of how to talk to women if you're talking to a woman you don't know. In fact, we all really interact with the world through heuristics, whether it's how we're talking to people, how we're using our car, how we're using our computer. We have rules of thumb for everything. Because in reality, the world's a really complicated place and we can't do things in great detail. We're just not clever enough. Consider, for instance, you've got a simple tree. Okay, it's a tree. But a tree's got thousands of leaves. You can't see every leaf. There's too much. What we do is we just kind of fudge it into an idea of a tree. We call it a tree, and it's just a concept without lots of detail. It lets us manage the information. There's more specific cases. So, for instance, if you have a group of people, like a group of ladies leaving church, you have a heuristic as to how to deal with them. You have expectations. These are older ladies, and they're all wearing hats and coats, and you speak to them in a certain way. You have a heuristic for that situation. Likewise, if you're outside a nightclub and there's a bunch of girls there, you have a heuristic. You try and chat them up and get told to sod off, but you know what to do because you've got some rules you can follow. But consider the situation that what if you were outside this nightclub and all the little old ladies from church were there, coming out or going in, and you were wondering, well, why are they here? Are they the cleaners? Are they clubbing? I don't know what to do. I don't know what to say. And you feel really maybe even a little bit panicked because you're experiencing a kind of cognitive dissonance. The world isn't making sense and you don't have a little program in your head to deal with this situation. And this, I think, is actually why many people are uncomfortable with trans people, some people especially, because they break up your heuristics. You just don't know what to do now. You feel really uncomfortable and uncertain. In fact, these heuristics are so important to us that our culture, our society actually requires us to enhance them. It actually requires us to pull in our characteristics even further, to standardize ourselves on the average even more than we naturally do. I'll explain why this is. To describe why we might do this or why societies do this all around the world, everywhere. Consider what life would be like if you were in some sort of medieval village with a few houses and a mill and a little stream running through and hills around you where we all farmed. Imagine your life was like that. You might live there. You might only meet a few hundred people in your entire life. Even the next village, the big village nearby, only has 100 people in it. You don't meet a lot of people. Any stranger walking through the village is really big news in the village. In an environment like that, you might know everybody really intimately. So if there's a guy called Bill who's a bit of a brawler, you all know Bill, you know what he's like. You know how to deal with him. If there's a guy called Will who likes to put flowers in his hair and play with the girls, that's Will, you know how to deal with him. you're each very, very familiar with every individual around you, and you treat them as such, and you don't have a standard model human to compare them to. You're all just yourselves. But this changed at some point, this kind of lifestyle change, actually well before the medieval times. Back in Mesopotamia, next to the Euphrates River, they found the slow-moving river. Farmers could move large amounts of food to a central location on the river, which allowed people to build the city of Ur, and many other cities at the same time, actually. But basically, civilization developed. And what they found when they developed civilization was that this town or city, as it was then, could have thousands of people in it. And each individual would then meet thousands of different people who they couldn't possibly know intimately. There were just too many merchants passing through and all sorts of things. So to make life easier to deal with so many people, there became a kind of onus on everybody to standardize themselves, to be more predictable, to conform to a set of rules, and to reduce all their outlier personality characteristics. Whatever they did in their own house was their own problem, or in the fields. But when you were in this social society, you had to conform more to a norm to allow other people to cope with you. So they had known expectations of you, and didn't have to spend all the time just eyeing you warily in case something went wrong. Now, if Brawler Bill turns up in this environment and starts a fight, well, what he's going to get is a pike staff over his head, of a quick trial in the morning, and drowned in the Euphrates in the afternoon. Because King Hammurabi just can't have you all fighting. He's got to have you all trading and making money, and making him rich. So this is why societies developed these kind of social customs, these stereotypings, is just to make us more predictable to the people around us, so that we can live in larger numbers. So given that we have a culture which requires us to kind of standardize ourselves and pull in all our more extreme personality traits, what's the effect of this? Well, how do we perceive this in our normal lives? Well, to illustrate this, I'm going to use a couple of graphs here, a male one and a female one. Obviously, I've color-coded them this time for clarity. These are the distributions of our agglomerated personalities. So starting with these two, which I'm going to call the natural aspects. These are the distributions of the way our agglomerated characteristics actually appear to the world, as you might see in a primitive village with few people in it. But I'm going to add to this the social aspects, as I call them, these constrained curves where people have been required to pull all the characteristics in. When we look here, we see that actually these social aspects, male and female, are actually quite separate. We've created these differences between men and women, or expectations of what we see. Now then, how does this affect people? Well, look here, I've drawn this bounding around the social aspect for females. And what you can see is that actually the majority of females do fall into that. Most people find it reasonably easy to fit into these expectations. But a few people don't. So if we look at the very feminine end of women here, these women are required to kind of, well, I suppose, man up a little bit and pull themselves more towards the male behaviors. Depending on how far away they are, it's more or less difficult. And for some women, I suspect it's actually very difficult. Some women might actually not be able to do that, and they might express this by doing things like just going and finding a very dominant guy as a husband, and having him keep her in the house and away from all these requirements of what are to her quite masculine behaviors. Alternatively, they might, say, become anorexic and make themselves very vulnerable and put themselves in a protected female type position. This, of course, is true of the male side as well. There's males out there who clearly have more risk-taking, more aggression behaviors. Maybe if they're techies, a tendency to obsess about technical issues. These guys are also required to pull these behaviors back in to the center. Those that fail could maybe become socially awkward, or they might even just end up somewhere like this. So, for most people, it works reasonably well. For some people, they're outliers and it doesn't. What about we might call the inliers, the males who are more towards the female side, and the females are more towards the male? Well, looking at the females, I've divided into these outliers into two halves here, and these are the halves. This one I've illustrated with a red box just to show that it's female. These are the ones that, while they're outliers, are still closer to the female center. And they might, also resent having to pull themselves in. And this probably is where you might find a lot of some kinds of feminists coming from, for instance. But then there's the others. What about these women who are even further over? They're actually closer to the male center than they are to the female one. So then they'd rather drag themselves over this way because it's actually closer, it's more natural to them if they've got to make the adjustment. And of course, the same thing is this is the green box for males. I'm illustrating the tail end of males here on the feminine side. Yeah, and for them as well, it's easier to jump over to the female side. And I personally believe this is what is happening with transgender people. Their characteristics are fallen in such a way that it's easier to conform to a male stereotype or a female to the other stereotype, shall we say, than to their natural biological one. Now, some people would argue that we don't need this. We don't need these kind of stereotypings in our society anymore. Things have moved on. We're a much more liberal society, and we're not starving, hungry anymore, and we have a rule-based society. We don't need to conform to these stereotypes. But the trouble is that some people actually need these social signposts. Now, if you work in the media, you're probably a real people person, or if you're in theatre, you're an actor or lobby or whatever. Maybe some are in sales. People who have good skills with people, that's probably true. They don't need these social signposts. They're good at reading people fairly quickly, and they're adept at getting to know people and maybe just seeing behind the stereotypes quite a lot. But they're not everybody. What about your Uncle Bob the builder? Now, everybody's got an Uncle Bob figure somewhere. Family wedding comes up, Auntie Margaret squeezes Uncle Bob into a suit, brings him to the wedding, tells him what tie to wear. And then what does Bob do? Well, Bob gets on as best he can until he can find Uncle Pete and they can just hide at the end of the bar. Because this is not really his scene, okay? He needs his social signposts. He needs to know when to crack a joke and not to stare at cleavages and when to laugh a bit and shake hands at the right time, buy you around. He needs to know these little rules to go through so he can get by with all these people he doesn't really know that well. Him and Uncle Pete, who's a computer programmer or something. This is how they get through it, by using these little rules of thumb and heuristics. And when it comes to meeting some guy in a dress and having to pretend you think he's a woman, that's just a step too far. So they invent a new rule, which is just don't make eye contact and stay the hell away from him. That's their solution to the problem. And this is because they're just not good at dealing with people. You need to have these rules when you first meet your Uncle Bobs of the world. You need to be able to fit into a category he can categorize, predict, and understand. Otherwise, he'll end up looking at you with a lump hammer behind his back just in case. Let me just emphasize that while it might seem to some people that Uncle Bob is being unreasonable by being unwilling to just take people as they are, consider the Globe Theatre and its complement of actors. Suppose I told them that they're all going to have to go and do a university-level mathematics course to continue working there. What would happen? Well, I suspect they'd all just throw themselves off the theatre. Because you really can't teach maths to these guys. They're just not wired that way. And likewise, you can't teach Uncle Bob just to accept people as they are on the spot. He really needs his guidelines to make this work. Where Uncle Bob is happy is on the building site with his workmates, where every morning they start off by just insulting each other to make sure nobody's become sensitive overnight. In fact, most of us have some sort of little subculture we like to get involved in, whether it's football or rock bands cosplaying, various fashion things. Some girls like to go up and dress as dolls, and some people like to fascinate themselves with glittery clothing and stuff, letting out their feminine sides. Obviously, there's drag acts, and yeah, just going to the pub with your friends, you kind of revert more to your natural self with people who know you, more like the people in that medieval village. So we all have our own ways of stepping out of the kind of standardization of people, places we go and let our guard down with like-minded people, because everybody finds it a bit of a strain. It's this social situation that's led to what we might call the gender wars. I've drawn here a couple of distributions of the natural and social aspects of males and females. Now, we know there's a lot of discourse going on around the media, etc., about bringing how these social aspects are artificial, the stereotypes, and men and women aren't that different, and we should bring them together so that men and women are expected to behave in a more, I don't know, similar way. And you can actually do that. There's nothing stopping us do that, because these social aspects are, in a sense, our inventions. Even the likes of Uncle Bob, he can deal with this. As long as he knows what the rules are, what he's supposed to expect of people, he can manage this, as long as it's clear. The trouble is, if I draw the envelope around the original social aspect for females, it's here, and I move it to where our new social aspect for females are, with a bit of overlap with the male aspect, what you see is that the number of actual female natural aspects that fell out, the number of women who no longer fall into that envelope, is much greater than the number of women who now fall into it. In other words, this works very well for a relatively small number of butch females, but it's a nightmare for a very large number of what I might call Disney princess, traditional wife type females, who find it really difficult to move themselves into this new natural aspect. Sorry, social aspect, into this new social aspect. And this is why this never really happens. Let's look at this another way. Here I've got one of these distributions I keep drawing. Imagine we turn it over and we look at it from the top. So what we see from the top is just a line. And then what I'm going to do with this line, I'm going to thicken it in the middle to represent more people being in the middle of that line. So imagine under the distribution, it will be higher at this point if we're looking from the top. So I've thickened it to represent that height. Then I'm going to add some more characteristics to it like this. So here's the 5 characteristics we used as examples before. And as I said, there are like really 30 characteristics or so to consider, but that's just too many to draw. Anyway, so if you put all these characteristics down like this, and we say, well, where do average people sit? They all sit around the center here. As I say, the agglomeration of their personalities would all be around this kind of area here. But if I separate them into men and women, it looks more like this. So the males are shifted one way and the females are shifted another, but there's a little bit of overlap. And then if we take these are the natural aspects, if we take the public aspects, how we're expected to behave by our society, it kind of looks more like this. The men are shifted to one side, the women to the other side. This is maybe a different way of looking at this. But just remember that obviously all sorts of people have difficulties fitting into these social aspects, and a lot of them would like to change things. But they're all pulling in different directions. They all don't fit in different ways. So the net result is that everything tends to stay in the centre, around the kind of conservative middle, which is why there is a kind of conservative trend in society, despite all the voices shouting for change. In reality, it can't change that much, because what makes things easier for one person makes them harder for another. So we're kind of stuck in the situation we're in. It's worth noting that people's characteristics, their personalities, are at the strongest actually when they're youngest, and things like their endocrine systems are strongest. That's why blue-haired liberals and social malcontents and student activists, they tend to be relatively young because that's the time of life when your personality characteristics are at their strongest and you find it most difficult to fit into the stereotypes. It's also one of the reasons why multiculturalism can be very difficult, because you have people like Uncle Bob seeing people around him whose culture he does not understand and does not know how to predict. So let's take this back to the trans debate. We've been talking generalities a bit here. So what this tells me really that trans is kind of an empty term. It's not very helpful at all when describing the situation these people find themselves in. Remember our discussion about genes, for instance. We said that the Y chromosome has kicks off these cascades of genes that on the X chromosome and on the Y chromosome, and some of these cascades don't work. Some of these genes fail, but it's unlikely that they'll all fail. Because if it was so unlikely that all these cascades failed, then these kind of issues would be cropping up everywhere all the time. In fact, it's relatively rare for a lot of these to fail. So remember the kid we had with the the risk-taking driving behavior, because he's got a very, very low neuroticism, despite the fact he's got some very, very female characteristics on the other side of the spectrum here. But some of his cascades worked and he got these male characteristics, and some didn't, and he's left with female characteristics. So he's kind of split. And then you see people, in the discussion about trans debates, there are guys who say they want to be women, but they want to go and compete in sports, and they want to be kickboxers or rock climbers as well. They want to have sex with women. Some people point at this and say, well, this shows that they're frauds. It's not that. It's not correct. It's exactly what you would expect to happen on the basis of this analysis. Some cascades failed, some didn't. So they get some of the male characteristics and they keep some of the female characteristics. They just got enough of the female ones that they really don't want to be kind of classed in the male stereotype. In fact, most what you call trans people, if you were a male to female trans, you'd be in here. Remember, I discussed this area here. This is amongst women where all the mad lesbians, or the mad feminists and the tomboys would be. The women who don't really fit into the women category, that's where all these guys would end up if they're trans. So in fact, while they're definitely not good at being men, they're not even that good at being women. They're really stuck in the middle for the most part. A very difficult place to be. And we call everything trans and cis. Like, this is kind of representing this gender fluidity. Well, it's not, it's binary. As say, so you're not male, so become a female. Again, it's binary. And in fact, their problem does not have a binary solution. Binaries are the wrong way to go with this. What you're really going to find is that the people that we simple-mindedly call trans, this very broad heading we use for them, they just don't fit into the birth gender stereotype, the artificial stereotype that society creates. But they don't fall a long way into the natural stereotype of the other gender either. What we call gender fluidity is actually, yes, it does exist, but it's only partial, and it applies to a very small number of people. So this is why actually we all find this conversation so confusing and difficult, because everybody's talking about partial truths. So, everybody can find some evidence for their position, but they can't really win the argument because the other side has also got evidence for the position. So it'll never end until we start really looking at what's going on and understanding it. I guess what I'm saying is there are no gender spirits. People are not gender dysphoric. Just think about it. If you were an Indian man and you wanted to be a woman, you'd want to dress as an Indian woman, because that image is given to you externally. Likewise, a Western man who wanted to be a woman would dress as a Western woman, because the image is given, it comes from an external source. Remember we mentioned this back when you lived in a medieval village and you might only meet a few hundred people in your life. Well, it didn't matter because you were just you. There wasn't an image to live up to. Or in a more extreme case, if you were washed ashore as a baby on a desert island and brought up by wolves or chimps or something, then no matter what your personality profile was, you wouldn't have anybody else there to tell you were wrong. You wouldn't have any image to fit into. And there'll be no image given to you from an external source. So the reality is that people are, it is a dysphoria with the societal expectation of gender. It's not a deep spiritual thing, it's just that they can't conform to what other people expect. So, to summarize the nub of the problem, so that we can go about attempting to solve it, trans people, through random processes of development, have personality traits that are so far from their birth gender norm that they find it easier to conform to the opposite sex public aspect. Now, just to be clear here, I'm not talking about bad actors or fetishists. I'm talking about people who have really experienced those development improbabilities and therefore are in this situation in a genuine way. I know the other cases exist, but that's not what I'm discussing. But we also have to be aware that a lot of people, particularly men, but also women, actually need these public aspects to be able to operate with other people in society, that we have to make ourselves predictable so other people can deal with us. Let's also be aware that most people actually seek some kind of outlet, some kind of escape from the standardization that we experience as a society. Trans people are just taking this thing very much further. And let's be clear what is not true. It's not true that trans people are born into the wrong body. Every body personality combination is unique. It's a function of your genes. Being trans is not a psychiatric condition. It's just an improbable personality profile. And there are not more than two genders. The things we refer to as genders are simply the natural focal points of personalities around the two biological sexes. You can call it gender if you want, but it's just the kind of personalities most people of a particular biological sex have. That's what we call gender. Great. So that's the sociology bit over now. Now I get to the bit that I really want to do, which is where I have a rant about how bloody stupid all the current solutions are. Let's start by considering a scenario. Imagine you've got a sea with an iceberg floating in it, and a ship comes along. I know, we'll name it Titanic for argument's sake. And Titanic crashes into said iceberg and rips a huge hole in its hull. What do you do about that? Well, what if the passengers and crew came up with a solution and they all gathered in the big ballroom before it flooded and agreed that the ship was in fact not sinking? This is everybody absolutely was agreed that the ship was not sinking, then the ship would certainly not sink, would it? Of course it bloody sinks. You can't wish or believe different realities into existence. You can't, if you're a very facially deformed, if you're very ugly, you can't identify your way into being beautiful. If you have cancer, you can't identify your way into being healthy. I could just go on and make all endless stupid scenarios. If you don't speak French, you can't identify as somebody who speaks French and therefore be able to speak French. And if you're not a woman, you can't just identify your way into being a woman. This is obvious to everybody. The reason I bring this up is it seems to be the principal solution everybody is trying to use to the very real problem of people who have unusual personality distributions. So at this point, let's go back and examine the history or the modern history of treating transgender conditions as they become recognized by modern medical practice. We'll put a timeline on here. And we'll look how far back it goes, this treatment. It actually goes back to 1921 when there was the first attempt at a female to male transition. This just basically meant removing the uterus and ovaries. At this time, of course, this was the only example of this happening. 1931, the first attempt at a male to female, which basically meant orchidectomy, penectomy, and vaginoplasty, or put another way, they cut off his cock and balls and tried to make him a vagina. Interestingly enough, the attempt at implanting a uterus also killed the patient. This time again, these were single operations happening at the time. Then 1952, the first attempt at a phalloplasty. This has become slightly more common. It was an attempt to build a penis for a female. But still, the numbers were in the tens back then. There were very small numbers, these operations. 1984, a lot of surgical developments. A new technique comes out. Operations are in the hundreds. Then in 1999, metoidioplasty, attempts to retain the clitoral nerves in the newly created penis. And by this point, there are thousands of operations taking place. I'm talking worldwide here, of course. And then we move into the 2000s, and we're starting to do all sorts of crazy things like give puberty blockers to children on the basis of very little evidence, etc. But this is the history of it. It's really been going on for 100 years now. We've been following through this basic process of trying to change a physical body to match a personality. But let's have a look at the history of the information that I've given you, I've shared with you earlier. If we're talking about all this, the statistical knowledge was known way back in 1920, fair enough. But the kind of ocean model, this kind of way of analysing personality, was only actually commonly adopted sometime in the 1980s. When just really as these operations were growing in numbers. And then the more recent stuff, the developmental genetics. This is really since the year 2000. This has become common. We've started to understand how our genes affect our personalities. Now, the problem here is that while I've been pointing out to you, the mechanics of this and how this all adds up to basically show that we have an individual with just an unusual distribution of personalities, this whole surgical process has been continuing apace. We've just been following the same pattern that we started in 1921 before we had the information that I've just discussed with you. So now we're just cutting things off people on an industrial scale. And we're using powerful pharmaceuticals to shrink people's endocrine systems away, the bits that we don't want of it. As I said, we've been doing this for 100 years. 100 years of cutting bits off people. Now, okay, to be fair, we used to have this kind of belief, this phrase of a woman trapped in a man's body or vice versa, or as the much quoted Native American phrase, the two-spirit people. My problem here is, I don't believe in no ghosts. Talking about spirits and gender identities and souls, this is not appropriate to modern medicine. The trouble is we've got all sorts of pseudo-intellectuals in the media and the film industry and all sorts of virtue signaling teachers and lecturers, or obviously humanities lecturers naturally. Not to mention even the legal system, and some self-appointed medics have actually merely made a profile for themselves after talking about these things and talking about gender identities and people's souls and spirits and things. What these people are actually doing is practicing something called shamanism, thinking about things in terms of their spirits. This does not belong in a modern society, in a modern medical system. The truth is that this idea that was fired out in 1921, by 2025, we can just see it's really overshot the mark. It's way over the top, trying to use surgery to effectively solve social awkwardness. The trouble is that this kind of cannonball of shamanic ideas that's gone flying out has gone away, and some people with, can we say, fetishist interests have kind of ridden this. But much more seriously, vulnerable people have kind of been dragged along in the wake of this, in the slipstream. People you would never normally think of curing autism or chronic shyness or something by doing surgery on someone. But people who have difficulty fitting in, some of them are latching onto this transgender idea and then being put down this surgical path which is an entirely inappropriate way to treat them. So what we've ended up with is a kind of population-wide attempts at self-delusion, where people seem to be expected to believe something they know isn't true. We've got wildly excessive medical interventions going on people, and this is all to make some people feel more accepted by pretending that they're a different gender. I mean biological gender. And this actually makes a lot of people really, really uncomfortable. All the Uncle Bobs of the world really don't do well with trying to pretend the guy in a wig and a dress is a woman. They find it very difficult. So we've got ourselves into this stupid situation. Maybe at the root of all this is the fact that the kind of people who are emotionally perceptive and are sympathetic to the difficulties of others are, as a general rule, absolutely terrible problem solvers. So they might be more aware of and more concerned by the struggles of people who are trans or who have unusual personality distributions, but they're the last people you should ever ask to try and solve the problem. Now let's talk about moving on. If you've believed any of these things, you've taken on faith, or for whatever reason, you've just assumed that this was the right thing to believe, you've never really thought it through in depth, okay? It doesn't make you a bad person. But now you're looking at it, it's just time to stop believing any of these things. They're nonsense. You meant well, you're trying to do the right thing, but on reflection and looking at them, they don't make any sense. So it's time to stop. So now I've done all this moaning and insulting people. Well, what's my idea to fix this? And to be honest, I don't really have one. But I think I can lay out some guidelines here as to how we should proceed. The first thing we need to do is analyze. We need to do more work. We need to work out what the personality traits are of trans people that make it so difficult for them to conform to their normal gender stereotype. Why it's such a strain for them in life. And we should really try and break this down into broad categories and maybe even compare it to the genetics. We might actually be able to find a way to actually clearly identify trans traits in people genetically, which will make it much easier to exclude those people who just want to get into the ladies. The next thing I'd say is that the solution to this does not involve chopping things off anybody. It's just down to social conventions. We have a social convention for males and a social convention for females, and it does restrict people, but we have to do that because we live in such large numbers. It would not be beyond the wit of man or woman to come up with a third in the middle gender category. For people who just find it really hard to conform to the stereotype, here's a way you can manage. Now, this, of course, will have to be clear to the world's Uncle Bobs. Okay, you have to have a clear way of showing Uncle Bob, this guy is not going to behave like a normal guy. He's a bit different. And Uncle Bob will be fine as long as he knows what's going on and he knows what to do about it. Whatever it is, it's going to have to be simple and obvious. And it's going to have to be permanent. There's going to be no, oh yeah, I'm trans today, I'm not trans the next day. It'll have to be some kind of clear indication that is permanent and cannot be changed. You've got to nail your colours to the mast, essentially, of being this kind of in the middle gender. And it'll have to be in some way legally recognised, such that anybody can say, well, this person has made it clear that they don't really conform to the normal genders. So they might just have to accept they're not going to get invited down the pub with the boys. On the other hand, there might be a lot of slack given to them in other ways. Whatever we do, we've got to just be rational and not go over the top about it. Let's just be sensible for a change. So I hope this will give us a few ideas to help us move forward a bit more sensibly. Thank you for listening.